Warning. The following content may be disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
After her older sisters had almost completely cut off contact with Sonata and each other, Sonata could barely stay alive on her own. The grief from their loss at the Battle of the Bands, followed by the shattering of their pendants that matched their shattered relationship, had changed Sonata almost entirely. She was no longer the innocent, sweet, happy girl that everyone had known her to be now. Sonata was nothing but a sad teenage-looking siren filled with nothing but rage and grief. The chamber where her angelic song once swelled was now nothing but a dark, empty space inside of her, and nothing could fill that void. No matter how hard she tried, Sonata missed her song, missed her old carefree demeanor, but most of all, she missed her sisters. She couldn't quite fathom why they chose to leave and go their separate ways, and practically abandon Sonata. Sonata lay in her bed in the dead of night, staring up at the ceiling, thinking, I don't understand how they could have beat us. Our music was flawless, our magic was at its peak, and we had everyone under a spell. She frowned. Well, almost everyone. Sonata's frown became more prominent as she recalled the night's events. She remembered the rush they hadn't had in centuries when they manipulated the minds of the students at Canterlot High, the excitement when they were finally able to gain enough power to take on their true siren forms, and then them, those Rainbow girls. Sonata remembered the odd burning sensation they took over her entire being when they had been shrouded in rainbow light. She remembered the pit in her stomach first take place when she weakly stood up and held her broken pendant in her hand and tried to sing once again, letting out nothing but broken notes. A few tears began to form in Sonata's eyes as she looked up blankly at the ceiling. She interlocked her fingers and blinked roughly, allowing the first few tears to fall down her blue cheeks and onto a pillow. She let out a long sigh and brought her hands to cover her mouth as she sat up. Her blue-streaked hair was down and messy, and she had dark bangs around her eyes, clearly displayed the lack of sleep she had been getting these past few months. Sonata looked out the bedroom window for a moment and listened. She could hear the cars driving across the road, people talking and shouting, and she could see the bars and restraints that illuminated the darkness that surrounded them. She took her hands away from her face and picked up her phone to check the time. The light from the phone lit up her bedroom entirely as she read the clock, 1:15 a.m. She looked at the time and then back out her window, sighed, and lifted herself up from the edge of her bed frame. Might as well, she thought to herself as she picked up her boots and slid them on. Sonata could still see the dim glow of the bars outside that struggled to stay lit. Against the intensity of the light, she didn't even bother to touch her hair as she put on the black jumper and some gray pants. Sonata exhaled, picked up her keys, and pushed the front door open and stepped outside. She slowly walked through the streets. She kept her head down and her hands in her pockets as she made her way to a 24-hour pizza joint that was just around the corner. The groups of people that walked past her laughed and pushed her out of the way forcefully, fueling her anger further, but she managed to stay composed as she took a deep breath and turned the corner. Sonata picked her head up, expecting to see the faint red glow of the pizza joint she was walking to, but was instead greeted by a dead-end alleyway. Damn it, she mumbled to herself through gritted teeth. That group of people must have pushed her in the wrong direction. Sonata stood there for a few minutes, taking deep breaths as she tried to calm herself down. The quiet sound of the dripping pipe definitely didn't make it easier. She took one last exhale before turning around quickly to leave the alleyway, but she jumped at the sight of someone standing at the end that seemed to be staring at her as they tilted her head and leaned forward. Sonata stared back as this person standing barely 10 feet away from her. "What?" Sonata said in a snappy tone. She didn't have the energy nor social battery for this. The figure jumped when they heard Sonata's voice, and then lifted their hood up, revealing a head of red and yellow streaked hair, green eyes, and light orange skin. Sonata's eyes widened for a moment and her mouth agape. "Sunset Shimmer?" Sonata said, her eyes narrowing as she let her hands and arms fall limp at her sides before balling them up into fists. "Sonata Dusk?" Sunset's stance was stiff and uncomfortable as she lifted her hands and balled them up in front of her chest. Sonata quickly walked over to Sunset, who was not currently alert enough to run away. "What are you doing here?" Sonata said as she gripped the front of Sunset's jumper and clenched her jaw. Sonatas hated Sunset Shimmer with a passion. She was the one who helped finish the Dazzlings off at the Battle of the Bands, after all. Sunset gasped as she felt Sonata's iron grip on her shirt, nearly lifting her off the ground. I live here," Sunset stammered as she stared hopelessly into Sonata's rage-filled eyes. Sunset was confused how genuinely scary Sonata was being. She had always thought of Sonata as being sweet and approachable, but now it seemed those days were long gone. Sonata gruntled and forcefully threw Sunset away from her, causing Sunset to smash against the floor hard. She grunted in pain as she looked up at Sonata, who was giving her a very intense death glare, with clenching her fists. Sunset's breathing was heavy as she stood up, slowly. Grunting at the pain the movement caused her, Sonata was now blocking the only exit to the alleyway, and she didn't look like she was going to be moving anytime soon. Sonata looked away from Sunset as she stood up, now glaring at the ground. She let out a long sigh before speaking through her clenched teeth. "You took everything from me. My powers, my immortality, my songs," said Sonata through deep breaths as she clenched her fists together. Sunset frowned and soon was somehow able to build up the courage to speak. Sunset looked to Sonata, then down to her own feet and back again. I know, but at least you'll always have your sisters," said Sunset as Sonata continued to glare at the ground. Once Sonata heard those words, her eyes widened slightly more, and she looked up slowly to Sunset. Sunset could clearly see the rage in Sonata's glowing red eyes, and she could almost feel the mixture of emotions flowing out of her. Sonata was now fully turned to Sunset, glaring intensely at her. Her knuckles were white, and her gritted teeth were showing. Sonata shook with what seemed to be rage, and without a warning ran full speed at Sunset, pinning her aggressively to the wall. Sunset yelped in pain and looked into Sonata's eyes. The expression on Sonata's face was almost powerful enough to kill someone. "No, I won't," Sonata said to Sunset, digging her nails into Sunset's skin. As she held her to the wall, Sunset struggled beneath Sonata's grip but failed to escape. "What?" Sunset asked as she looked helplessly into Sonata's eyes. "My sisters. They left me." Sonata's tone was getting more and more agitated the more Sunset tried to escape. "I have nothing, and I have no one thanks to you." Sonata dug her nails deeper into Sunset's flesh as she remembered what she had done to her and her sisters. We had to," Sunset answered. She grit her teeth and hissed through them as she felt the stinging pain grow stronger as Sonata dug her nails more into her forearms. Sonata's eyes widened again as she pushed Sunset onto the ground in anger. "You didn't have to do anything!" Sonata yelled at Sunset as she saw how little Sunset really cared that she had ruined her life. Sonata let out a long sigh and looked down in front of Sunset, who was sat on the floor in pain looking up at Sonata. Sonata clenched her fist tighter and Sunset saw a few tears run down her cheeks as Sonata opened her mouth to speak. Those friends of yours gave you a second chance after what you did. Why did no one give us that? Sonata let out another shaky sigh as she stood there, standing intimidatingly over Sunset Shimmer. Sunset didn't have an answer to that. She just stood up weakly until she was face to face with Sonata. Sonata glared at Sunset for a few moments before spotting something behind her. Pushing her aside to see what it was, Sunset grunted when she was pushed, and she turned around to see what Sonata was doing. She watched as Sonata knelt down behind a dumpster and picked something up. Sunset tilted her head, trying to get a better look at what Sonata had found. Sonata stood up, holding the object in her hand. As she turned it around a few times, she smirked and slowly turned back around to face Sunset, who was standing there, hugging herself and shivering, but not due to the cold night air. Sonata chuckled quietly as she turned around, still looking down at the object she now clenched tightly in her palm. As Sonata continued to turn, Sunset froze as soon as she figured what Sonata was holding. Clenched tightly in Sonata's hand was a sharp, long knife that glistened in the moonlight. Sunset gasped and thought about running, but she couldn't move. You took everything I held dear to me. You ripped my sense of life from me. You took away our one and only chance to enslave humanity, and worst of all, you took my sisters. Sonata looked down at the knife, then back to Sunset, who was trembling in fear. Now, I'm going to show you what it's like to have something dear to you taken away. Sunset's eyes widened more, and she turned to run, but Sonata was too fast. Sonata gripped Sunset's collar and pulled her back, pushing her to the ground. No, wait! Sunset's sentence was cut short by the agonizing sensation of something piercing through her skin. She screamed as Sonata peeled the knife out of Sunset's back. In a big fountain of blood, Sonata smiled evilly as she listened to the sounds of Sunset's screams. Sonata watched as Sunset tried to crawl away, but to no avail, as Sonata pulled her back by her ankles, pinned her to the wall, and forcefully put her hand over Sunset's mouth to keep her quiet. She could feel Sunset's tears as they streamed down her cheeks like small waterfalls. Sunset fought Sonata off the best she could, but Sonata had built up so much rage over the past few months. It only made her stronger. She pushed Sunset's head back, slamming it against a brick wall as she pushed the knife through her stomach. Sunset screamed weakly as she felt the burning, anguishing pain throughout her entire being. Sonata was smiling manically as Sunset's blood splashed upon her face. Sonata began to quickly stab Sunset more, again and again, blood splattering everywhere. Sunset could hear buzzing and her vision began to blur, and she became aware of how loud the sounds her body made really were. Sonata pulled the knife out of Sunset's stomach and whispered into her ear, "At least you'll always have your friends." And with that, she slammed the knife into Sunset's chest, and Sunset's eyes rolled back into her head as she fell onto the ground in front of Sonata's feet. Sonata took a deep breath and dropped the knife with a loud clank as she looked down at Sunset's lifeless, mangled body. Sonata picked Sunset's corpse up and hid her behind the dumpster along with the knife. She simply stood there for a few minutes, thinking about what she'd just done. She wiped her face and painted her hands with Sunset's blood in the process. Sunset's corpse was destroyed. Her stomach was practically inside out, and she was bleeding from her mouth and eyes. Her arms were scratched, and her face was nearly unchanged from when Sonata had first stabbed her with the knife. Sonata knelt next to Sunset's body, tears falling from her eyes and smiling. She was just proud of herself, and for the first time in months, she wasn't angry. She wasn't sad. She was content, and she felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. She smiled contently to herself. Her smile faded as quickly as it came, though, as she remembered Sunset Shimmer was not the only member of the Rainbow. Sonata shrugged and smirked. Oh well, maybe next time I can use a better knife.